In 1585, John White traveled to Europe from the colony of Roanoke to pick up resources. The Spanish War delayed his return for 5 years, and in 1590 he found that 121 colonists in the island of Roanoke disappeared without a trace. On April 26, 1986, almost 50,000 people were evacuated from the town of Pripyat following Chernobyl's nuclear power plant incident. Now the town is empty, being taken over by vegetation. In the span of 50 minutes, they evacuated almost 50,000 residents, turning the bustling city into a ghost town in less than an hour. In 1978, over 918 people were killed in Jonestown. Also known as the People's Temple Agricultural Project, it was a mass murder of devoted followers who gave their money, bodies, and minds to the manipulative monster that was Jim Jones. There were news stories on the subject that ran rampant and continue to echo today. Over 918 lives were taken that day. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Over 239 passengers and crew members disappeared. Even after extensive investigations as to where the airplane might be, the case grew cold over time. Mass disappearances are not common, but they do a few things. They captivate the imagination of those who hear about them, and they raise more questions than answers. And also, it's nothing new. That's why when in 2004, when over 300 men, women, and children were missing from a research facility, it wasn't surprising that many people were unaware of it. After all of these stories of mass disappearances, this story was a tragedy among other tragedies.
911, what is your emergency? Hello? 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 Are you there?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. What is the nature of your emergency?
We need emergency services in Limetown. Ambulances are the firemen, police, damages, and the whole army.
Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down.
Turn it off! Turn it!
Ma'am, are you still there?
This phone call was made on February 8, 2004 in White County, Tennessee, in a small research town called Limetown. Emergency services, along with a local news source, WVPK, arrived at the gates of Limetown, which were shut and protected by security.
We're standing at the outer security gates of Limetown, and as you can see, there is a large gathering of police officers and firefighters here, but they are not being allowed into the facility.
No one, not even the medics, were allowed in. For days, there was no visible activity inside of the town except for a pillar of smoke in the town square.
There is no one on the grounds that I can see, but there does appear to be a large smoldering bonfire, I would guess.
And on February 11th, just 3 days after the disturbing phone call, Limetown had opened its gates and all security personnel evacuated.
The security at the front gate is now driving away from the facility. Sir, can you tell us what is happening?
Except for one person. Dr. Oscar Totem was burned at the stake. But let's take a step back. Why was Limetown made, and what was Dr. Oscar Totem responsible for to result in him being burned at the stake? In 2002, R.B. Villard funded over $2 billion for the construction of a town in White County, Tennessee. It was planned to hold over 1,000 residents. This town was constructed over an elaborate cave network that was used to help insulate the houses. A colleague of his, Dr. Oscar Totem, began recruitment in search for leading researchers in the neuroscience field all around the world starting in June of that year. Exactly 1 year later, on June 3, 2003, Limetown had opened its doors. One of these researchers were of special interest. His name was Emil Haddock. We'll get back to him soon. The other residents of the town were the family members of the town's leading researchers. Other people were also brought into the town to be barbers, janitors, box office workers, pharmacists. In those 8 months, Limetown was soon a real bustling town. Until the night of what would be remembered as the Panic.
Emergency services in Limetown.
That's when, in the span of 3 days, all 327 residents of Limetown had disappeared off the face of the earth without a trace. No footprints, not a drop of blood or a hair follicle. Everyone was gone except for the burned body of Dr. Oscar Totem and the security personnel that also disappeared after they allowed public entry. And this story, this whole strange and elaborate tragedy, was all fake.
First is called Limetown.
I love the podcast Limetown.
Limetown.
We are the creators of Limetown.
Zach Akers and Skip Bronke wrote, directed, and produced the fictional podcast known as Limetown in 2015. In less than 2 months, the show became the #1 podcast in the United States. It follows the story of Leah Haddock, an investigative reporter from American Public Radio, APR. As she tries to uncover the truth of what happened to the people in Limetown, a dark secret begins to emerge about the experiments that took place in the facility. Now, if this story interests you at all, I recommend listening to the first 6 episodes before continuing with this video. There are major spoilers for the whole show. Here's a rundown of the plot. Leah Haddock investigates Limetown 15 years after the event happened, mostly motivated in learning about what happened to her uncle Emil. She gets contacted by one of the survivors of the tragedy, Winona, who deals with brain damage, but she recalls seeing a man, who she calls the man we were all there for, testing a telepathic technology on another man who, even though he was a room away, drew the exact same image with the same body movements as the man they were all there for. Later on, Leah then finds Dr. Warren Chambers, a reverend who helps those near death. He tells Leah about his role in Limetown, being a farmer who participated in an experiment with a pig, Napoleon. They were both implanted with a technology that allows them to communicate with each other via their minds. After the pig was traumatized, Chambers had no choice but to kill the pig after receiving nothing but turmoil from the pig's mind. After he tells this story to Leah, he is killed by a drunk driver. She begins to feel suspicious, as she also receives a threatening phone call from her mother's house. Leah is also contacted by Max Finlayson, one of the leading researchers of Limetown alongside Oscar Totem. He confirms to Leah that the purpose of the town was, in fact, to test mind-to-mind communicating technology. He is later killed more directly by the people connected to Limetown. Leah, now paranoid, meets Deirdre, Max Finlayson's wife, who explains that she is the reason for the panic. Apparently, Limetown and the people were the experiment. Half of the citizens were implanted with the technology and the other half was not. That began a rift between the self-titled old school and new school citizens. Max had the tech and Deirdre did not. So, as he gave her the technology, the old school revolted, and as a result, killed Oscar Totem. On the final episode, Leah records a live episode meeting with Lenore Dougal, a woman who proves herself as the mayor of Limetown with an accounting ledger. She details her experiments with Emil, harnessing his telekinetic abilities. Then, as she starts a 12-minute timer, she explains how she acted as a mole for a third party to obtain the technology and sell it to the military. As the panic ensued, she locked the gates of Limetown and sent in personnel from this third party to extract those with the technology through the limestone caves underneath the town, take the technology, and bribe and threaten the citizens to relocate in different areas across the world. All of the old school who didn't survive were killed by biocremation using a lie. Lenore takes a pill that kills her and encourages Leah to take the same pill. She denies and instead is kidnapped by the mysterious third party before the live stream ends. As stated earlier, 2UP's Limetown became such a popular hit in the United States that it was #1 on the podcast list, and what's more interesting than its success is why it was successful. The way it was presented is very much like an NPR segment on the radio, with heavy editing, interview styles, and professionalism.
So we reached out to this historian.
My name's Khalil Gibran Muhammad. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School.
In his book, Khalil lays out a historical argument.
As his father dubbed him for the sake of efficiency.
That's Hunter Garrett, Mr. Villard's biographer.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? We'll get back to him in a bit.
For lack of a better word, when listening to the story, it's convincing. So convincing that the outlandish claim that Limetown was made for the sole purpose of telepathic communication was almost an afterthought when listening to the show. For most, the show was a deep dive into the people who went missing, how they went missing, and where they were. In fact, that's what Leah Haddock had in mind when she began the investigation before uncovering the truth. The story of a town created for the sole purpose of being a test for the new technology was, of course, fictional, but the backdrop that they used for that story to be told was very much rooted in reality. As I've stated before, there have been many accounts of mass disappearances, missing towns, people with families and lives of their own that have their own following as well. True crime communities tend to gravitate to the fate of people involved in these tragedies, and in turn, you have a target audience, people interested in unsolved mysteries. You have a story of a tragedy of this size, and people start to listen. In fact, there's a surplus of true crime podcasts, from True Crime Daily, Unsolved Murders, Headspin, The Lighthouse, PNW True Crime, Icelandic True Crime, Truer Crime Whispers, Cults. There's a bunch of these. So much so that if you already listened to a few of these, chances are that when you first heard of Limetown, you would think that it was real as well.
I thought the podcast was real. Genuinely speaking.
Like, we had one person say on their like, I'm on my lunch break, I'm gonna drive to Limetown.
They were in Tennessee.
Yeah, they were like
already there.
I'm gonna drive to Limetown. And I think we immediately were like, this is a fake show, this is fake,
Don't go anywhere.
Don't go.
With the success of the show, they began production on season 2 of Limetown that was released on October 30th in 2018, 3 years after the first season. And, well, a few people were not excited about the second season, for a few key reasons.
And I guess I'm just going to say that in hindsight, Limetown Season 2 is disappointing. And it just felt like they went from like one disjointed plot line to the other.
The second season followed Charlie, who is interrogated by her unnamed kidnapper. The story of her voyage to look for Leah Haddock is told through tape recordings. We find out about The Bridge, another research facility much like Limetown, except that the tech isn't an implant, it's a contact lens, and instead of a town, it's a floating facility in the water. The Bridge also inevitably crashes and burns like Limetown had, shunning Emil Haddock. We later find out that Emil is the person who has imprisoned Charlie in an attempt to look for Leah. She then implies that not only had she possibly been lying about her entire story, but that Leah is either missing or dead. We do find Leah at the end of the show, but we don't know where she is or who she is with. So nothing was fucking answered. There were answers, but they were in a very poorly written, long, and tedious to read book. Only 2 weeks later, after the release of the second season of Limetown, a book was released by the same name that acted as a prequel to the entire show. Here's all you have to know. Leah and her mom have premonitionary dreams, and Emil finds an organization that tests on people with superpowers like his mom, his own, Leah's mom, and Leah. If one hadn't read the book, they would have never come to this conclusion. It says it right there in the novel that Leah was taken by this organization as they ask Emil about his dreams, a question Leah's kidnappers ask her at the end of this series.
Tell me about your dreams. Tell me everything you remember. Recipient?
I dreamt you thought you won. That you thought you made Limetown a ghost story again.
But that wasn't the last straw for the fans. In 2019, Facebook Watch, I guess that's a thing, released Limetown, a live-action retelling of Season 1 of the podcast starring Jessica Biel as Leah Haddock and Stanley Tucci as Emil Haddock. The show follows the first season of the podcast almost to a T, except for a few details that were added to expand to the world of the show. They don't affect the main plot of her finding the secrets of Limetown, so I can just list them off here. Number 1. Leah is a lesbian. I have no real problem with this point, but it is not integral to the plot at all. Number 2, Leah has a sound fetish. Now, before you click off thinking that I'm in support of this change, I understand why it seems trivial and unimportant to the plot. However, I do think that the reason that she's obsessed with listening, besides the fact that it's literally her whole job, is because she's used to having full conversations with Emil when she was a child. That's why she wants to find Emil. That's why she has repercussions for basically her whole job. She's heard too much in an attempt to relive her past with her estranged uncle. Number 3, Leah kills her co-producer. Literally no reason but to show how far she's willing to go for her story, which is only an attempt to try and find Emil, so it's just not worth it, really. Number 4, Emil meets Leah before the live stream. Yes, literally the one reason she's doing this story, walks in on the 11th hour just so she can confront him, leave, and then get kidnapped. That is the reason for her story, right in front of her, a new life with her uncle, and yet she just walks away. Number 5, Leah is masochistic. She harms herself often, makes herself bleed, slaps herself, all that jazz. Number 6, Leah still does not have premonitionary dreams, unlike what the book and the second season of the podcast want you to believe. Why? Why introduce this in the second season and in the book, and make it a large part of the story without ever mentioning it again? I asked a few fans on the Limetown subreddit what made them disinterested in the show after the release of Season 2. Here are a few notable answers.
Where I became concerned was when it became apparent that they were massively retconning things for the book, including re-editing the podcast in order to remove references to later canon.
I guess I just found it started covering topics that didn't intrigue me. I was into the science portion, and in my opinion, it started becoming more fantastical than I would have liked.
Kind of felt like Season 2 told me to go fuck myself because I actually cared about the story.
It didn't answer a single question raised from Season 1. I dropped my water. Booyah!
From these answers and a few posts that I read, I think the main reason why fans dislike the additions to the story is that it wasn't an addition to the story. It was its own story that tried to loosely connect to Limetown. But what interested them in Limetown in the first place wasn't the fantastical. What started off as a story of a young woman looking for answers about a missing town and the lives the tragedy affected turned into the story of telekinetic mind powers, government conspiracies, prophetic dreams. There was an obvious disconnect. The way that Limetown was originally written was that Leah Haddock was not only the main character, she was the narrator first and foremost.
My name is Leah Haddock, and I am an investigative reporter with APR. I was 17 years old as the events of Limetown unfolded, and I became somewhat of a Limetown news junkie. In the spirit of full disclosure, it is also a personal story to me, as an uncle on my father's side, granted one I only ever heard stories about and never met beyond infancy, Dr. Emil Haddock, is counted as one of the missing.
But with attempts to make her a fully fleshed character who changes, has internal conflict, ulterior motives, secrets, and even magic mind powers, it distracts from what made Limetown such a success in the first place. A tragedy, a mystery, and the search for answers. The only other occasion that I can compare the fall of Limetown to would be with Fantastic Daily. I recommend you watch Inside a Mind's video on the subject. It's well edited, well produced, and goes into way more detail than I ever will. But here's the gist of it. The YouTube channel starts called Fantastic Daily and uploads top 10 lists. The only thing is that all of those facts were fake, and instead some of those videos actually tell the story of the channel runner who was being tormented by black-eyed children. His channel blows up with a discussion about the validity of his claims on Facebook, paranormal pages, places where he purposefully put his videos, knowing that they were going to get the target audience that he wanted. People who liked the paranormal would love to see a show about the paranormal. However, there was a problem with that. The show was meant to be just that, a show, a series that was scripted, written, and produced by himself. However, the people consuming the media had taken it at face value, believing that he was actually being persecuted by ghosts. Once it was revealed that it was all fake, his audience turned their backs, thinking that he was purposefully lying instead of telling a story. His mistake was that he decided to continue to tell a story with the pretense that his audience knew it was a story. But his audience were people who actually believed in the paranormal. They don't want a story about the paranormal. They want proof. They want validity. And those who listened to Limetown were probably interested in that extensive lists of podcasts that I listed earlier. They wanted to hear the story of a tragedy and the justice and the truth being revealed, and those who knew it was fiction wanted characters who not only felt real but were fleshed out. But it's difficult to have both. You're always going to disappoint someone. Half of the audience loved the true crime feel of the show, this documentary feel that was present at the time with many podcasts. Other fans who liked the character work were gravitating towards the interesting dialogue and the way that the story and characters were revealed throughout what the characters said. But as they began to flesh out the story, they valued the needs of those who liked the character development instead of those who liked the crime. Then the story begins to lose the character lovers once it starts to focus on the tragedy of Limetown and the bridge. And then everyone loses interest when the whole purpose of a book or TV show is to add extra exposition to a show that's already popular on its own. Limetown is a good show. It has great characters, but those characters that we spent 3 years to re-listening about had no bearing on the show as a whole. Then new characters were added to the show, and even more in the book. Those characters, the newly introduced characters, were not as well fleshed out enough to make us understand their motives, and the old ones were left abandoned, and that was interpreted as, we don't care about these characters anymore. That's their role in the story, and it's been completed. When the characters begin to lose their shape, when the story begins to deviate too much from the plausibility of the original source material, maybe that's a sign that you shouldn't continue telling the story. Because the prequel book was only needed for Season 2, and then Season 2 added nothing to Season 1, and the show added nothing to either of those. It was as though they wanted to completely restart the process of telling the story. A podcast didn't make Leah a character, so let's make an entire show about her as a character. But that's not why people loved the podcast. Let's write a book about the main character having mind powers and a secret organization that tests on people. But that's not why people loved the podcast. People loved the podcast because it was a mystery first and a sci-fi thriller second. It was about finding answers, uncovering the truth, and none of the media that came after the first season ever made the show justice. While I don't think that the show itself can be saved, I do think that people can learn from what the show did wrong. It tapped into an audience that wanted more of what it had, and instead gave them something different over and over and over again with the guise of a mystery being solved. Instead, they should have seen what worked with the original story and elaborated on that rather than trying to make something bigger, newer, and different from what they originally had in mind. And for those creators who have trouble continuing their story, let this be a lesson you take away from the tragedy of Limetown. Whatever made your product work, focus on that and make it work better.